Imagine carrying the weight of an entire Ummah on your shoulders, knowing one wrong step could lead to darkness for generations. This is the story of a leader who looked into the eyes of defeat and answered with hope, courage, and a will carved from iron. Saladin stood alone under the silent sky, the battlefield still echoing in his mind. The air carried a heaviness that only a defeated army could understand, yet his face did not mirror despair. Instead, it held a quiet determination, as though he saw something far beyond the ruin in front of him. Soldiers watched him from a distance, expecting orders, expecting anger, expecting anything that resembled the usual reaction of a leader after devastation. But he gave them none of that. Instead, he walked away from the camp and found a place where the earth was cold and untouched by the chaos of war. He knelt quietly, as if bowing before the unseen strength he trusted more than swords or armies. His breath trembled, not because of fear, but because he knew that moments like these shaped the destiny of nations. For a long while he said nothing. Silence was his armor. In the darkness he lowered his forehead to the ground. This was not the posture of defeat. It was the posture of a man who knew that no loss on earth could overpower a heart connected to the Almighty. Each second of that prostration felt like a weight lifting from the world, as if his prayer pressed against the sky itself. His commanders exchanged worried glances, unsure how to interpret such calm in the face of devastation. The wind blew harder, carrying grains of sand across his cloak, but he didn't move. His stillness felt supernatural, like a force gathering around him. Those who watched began to feel their own fear turn into something else, something close to awe. They realized their leader was not rebuilding strategies, he was rebuilding his soul first, and through that, the strength of an entire nation. When he finally raised his head, there was a glow in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It wasn't rage. It wasn't despair. It was clarity. A fierce, unshakable clarity that comes only from surrendering everything to the one who controls all outcomes. For a moment, even the desert wind seemed to pause, as though witnessing a turning point. He wiped the dust from his face, but not the emotion from his heart. He knew the world would judge him by the scale of defeat, but he also knew that Allah judged by sincerity, not numbers or battle outcomes. That understanding rebuilt something inside him that no army could break. As he stood up, the weight of responsibility returned, but this time it felt lighter. He was not standing on the remains of a lost battle. He was standing on the beginning of a new test. A test that would demand more patience, more courage, and more faith than ever before, and he was ready. When he walked back toward the camp, his steps were slow but steady. The soldiers who looked at him saw a man transformed. A leader who had entered that moment exhausted, wounded, and burdened, but who emerged with an unbreakable certainty in his heart. Their own fears started to crumble as they watched him. Someone whispered, "He hasn't lost. He's preparing." That whisper spread among the ranks like a spark across dry grass. It reminded every soldier that defeat is only final for those who surrender their will, and Saladin's will had just been reforged in the deepest silence of prayer. And so the army, though shaken, found themselves steadying their breath, because they realized their leader's strength did not come from the sword in his hand, but from the calmness of his sajda. That was the moment where everything changed, not on the battlefield, but in the unseen world where true victories are written before they appear on earth. Rumors traveled through the night like ghosts slipping between tents. Soldiers pretended to sleep, but the tension in the air kept their eyes open. They had heard whispers that some rulers, men who once stood proudly beside Saladin, had begun sending secret messages to the Crusaders. Betrayal was not just a wound, it was poison, and everyone feared what would happen when their leader found out. When the news finally reached Saladin, the messenger delivering it could barely breathe. He expected fury, a storm of anger, or at least a command to punish someone. But Saladin only listened quietly, his expression unreadable. He dismissed the messenger with a calm nod, leaving everyone confused. How could a man react so gently to something so sharp? In the privacy of his tent, the lantern flickered, casting shadows across his face. Instead of pacing or shouting, he simply sat on the floor, lost in deep thought. He had faced enemies all his life, but betrayal from his own people had always been the heaviest burden. Yet even then, he refused to allow bitterness to take root in his heart. When he finally spoke, the words were soft but carried a power that shook the listener more than any scream could. "People betray," he said, "but Allah never does." The sentence wasn't loud, but it was enough to drain the fear from the room. It felt like a reminder that the ultimate support did not come from fragile alliances or shifting loyalties, but from the one who controlled every heart. Outside, the officers waited, bracing themselves for harsh decisions. But when Saladin stepped out, his face held no anger. Only strength mixed with a strange calmness. Those who expected him to lash out found themselves disarmed by his composure. They realized something terrifying. A leader who cannot be broken by betrayal becomes someone almost impossible to defeat. As the night deepened, more details of the treachery surfaced, but Saladin didn't allow a single word of revenge to pass his lips. Instead, he sent orders to maintain discipline, protect civilians, and prepare for the next campaign. His focus remained sharp, as if betrayal was only a passing dust storm and not a mountain blocking his path. Some soldiers whispered among themselves, trying to understand how he remained so steady. "If it were me," one said, "I would have punished them immediately." Another answered, "He doesn't follow anger, he follows trust." And that truth spread through the camp like a quiet fire, warming every shaken heart. What unnerved his enemies even more was that he didn't crumble. They expected betrayal to weaken him, to fracture his resolve. Instead, it strengthened the clarity in his eyes, the steadiness of his voice, the precision of his decisions. His patience became a weapon sharper than any blade. The traitors who heard about his response felt a chill run down their spines. They had counted on breaking him from inside, not realizing that Saladin's loyalty to Allah made him immune to the traps of ego and despair. Their schemes suddenly felt small, almost pathetic, compared to the vastness of his trust. By dawn, the soldiers saw their leader standing at the edge of the camp, gazing into the horizon. He looked like a man who carried wounds but refused to let them darken his heart. And in that moment, every soldier understood that betrayal had not weakened him. It had revealed the depth of his strength. His enemies could attack from the outside, his rivals could betray him from within, but nothing could shake a heart anchored so firmly in faith. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over a land that had once echoed with the shouts of warriors. Now it was silent, terrifyingly silent. Saladin rode slowly across the battlefield, the hooves of his horse pressing into soil that had absorbed too much blood. Every few steps, something cracked beneath the weight, shattered shields, broken spears, and bones that the desert had already begun to claim. Soldiers following behind him shifted uneasily, trying not to look down. The wind carried the smell of dust mixed with the memory of defeat. It wasn't just the battlefield that looked broken, the hearts of the men felt the same. Many lowered their eyes, unable to face the remnants of a battle that had scarred their spirits. But Saladin kept riding, his gaze steady, as if the devastation around him was something he needed to witness with open eyes. He wanted to remember, not to break, but to rebuild. When he dismounted, the entire army went silent. He walked across the crushed landscape with slow steps, the ground crunching beneath his boots. Every cracked bone seemed to whisper stories of bravery, sacrifice, and unfinished battles. Yet Saladin didn't flinch. His face held neither fear nor grief, only a deep, unwavering calm. It was as though each sound beneath his feet strengthened something inside him rather than weakening it. His commanders hesitated before following. They feared what the sight would do to his resolve, but instead they found themselves afraid of the calmness he carried. It was not natural. It was something forged from patience, faith, and the weight of responsibility. He paused near the remains of a fallen warrior, looking down for a long moment, silently honoring the sacrifice without a single spoken word. A gust of wind swept across the field, swirling dust into the air. The soldiers shielded their faces, but Saladin continued to stand still, letting the dust brush against him. To him, this devastation was not a reminder of defeat, but a reminder of the work left undone. He had no fear of broken landscapes, only fear of broken hope. Every step he took sounded louder than the last, echoing across the empty field like a slow drumbeat. The men behind him began to realize something extraordinary. Their leader was walking through the ruins, as if claiming them, turning the battlefield into a promise rather than a warning. It was unsettling yet strangely comforting. A young soldier watching him whispered to another, "How is he not shaken?" The older soldier shook his head slowly. "Because he walks with a purpose that doesn't end with the rise or fall of one battle." Their words were soft, but they reflected the growing realization that Saladin's strength was carved from something deeper than courage. It was carved from conviction. As he continued, the desert seemed to respond. The silence that once felt heavy now felt expectant, as if the land itself was listening to the rhythm of his steps. Every moment he spent in that place felt like he was reclaiming a piece of the dignity that the enemy had tried to take. The soldiers watching him felt their own despair dissolving, replaced by a rising determination. When he finally paused at the far edge of the field, he looked back, not at the bones or the broken weapons, but at his army. The message in his eyes was silent but clear. This field is not our ending, it is our beginning, and just like that, the battlefield of bones transformed in the minds of his soldiers. No longer a graveyard of hope, but a reminder that true strength is forged in the places where most hearts break, and his heart had refused to break at all. The letter arrived at dusk, carried by a trembling messenger who clearly feared the reaction it might provoke. The parchment was sealed with the mark of a Crusader commander, an enemy who had chosen arrogance over wisdom. Saladin accepted it without expression, his fingers steady as he broke the seal. Around him, advisors watched closely, expecting tension, perhaps anger, or even a command for punishment. But his face remained unreadable, calm in a way that unsettled even the bravest of them. As his eyes moved across the words, the flicker of the lantern revealed the insults carved in ink. The letter mocked his army, mocked his loss, and mocked the belief that had carried them through every hardship. It was written with a confidence that dripped with arrogance, confidence that Saladin had fallen, that he was broken, that his spirit had finally been crushed under the weight of defeat. A few commanders clenched their fists, unable to contain their disgust, but Saladin continued reading with the same quiet focus. When he finished, he didn't slam the parchment down or raise his voice. Instead, he held it gently, almost thoughtfully, as though he were weighing something far deeper than the words themselves. For a long moment he simply stared at the candle flame in front of him. The silence became sharp, filling the tent with an eerie stillness that no one dared to break. Then, with movements slow and deliberate, he held the letter close to the flame. The fire caught the parchment's edge, and the ink began to curl as the mocking words dissolved into smoke. The commanders watched with wide eyes, half expecting him to seize the ashes in anger. But he didn't. He simply watched the flames consume the arrogance, watched it turn from insult to nothingness. A few embers drifted upward, disappearing into the dark of the tent. Saladin finally spoke, his voice soft but carrying a force that made every man straighten. "This," he said, "is the only reply arrogance deserves." There was no fury, just a calm that cut deeper than any shout could. His composure was terrifying in its quiet power. The soldiers near the entrance exchanged glances, suddenly aware that their leader operated on a level far beyond simple retaliation. His strength didn't come from matching insults with insults. It came from refusing to let arrogance live long enough to poison his heart. That single act, burning the letter, became a message far louder than any written response could ever be. Outside the tent, the night wind seemed to shift, carrying an energy that felt different, sharper, clearer. The soldiers didn't know exactly what had happened inside, but they could sense a change. They could feel a firmness settling back into their leader's presence. It was as if burning that letter had burned away the last shadow of doubt clinging to the camp. Meanwhile, the crusader who sent the message never received a reply. Days passed, then weeks, and in that silence he began to feel something unexpected fear. Because a man who refuses to answer mockery is a man who is preparing for something greater than words. He is preparing for a return that requires no explanations. Back in his camp, Saladin continued his work with renewed clarity. His voice, his decisions, even his footsteps seemed infused with a quiet determination that spread to his soldiers like a wave. They felt steadier, stronger, more certain not because their wounds had healed, but because their leader's heart had remained untainted. And in the end, that single moment of burning the letter became symbolic. It showed everyone watching that insults and mockery are nothing but smoke, temporary, weak, destined to vanish. And the man who stood watching them burn was someone no enemy's words could ever shake. The order came without a shout, without drama. Just a quiet command passed from rider to rider as the moon hung high in the sky. Saladin had decided the army would move before dawn, silently, without torches or drums. Some soldiers blinked in surprise. Marching through the night was risky, exhausting, and frightening, but when the command came from him, hesitation vanished. His decisions were never impulsive. They were carved from faith and strategy intertwined. The night was cold, the kind that bites at the edges of a soldier's resolve. Yet when the horses were prepared and the saddles tightened, an unusual stillness settled across the camp. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of purpose. Thousands of men moved like shadows under the moonlight, their armor muted, their steps deliberate. Even the stars seemed dimmer, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Saladin led from the front, his horse walking with patience and strength. He carried no torch, depending only on the faint silver glow from the heavens and the instincts formed by years of battle. Behind him, the ground trembled not from chaos but from unified motion. The deep rhythm of hooves beating against earth felt like a heartbeat, steady, controlled, unstoppable. Every few miles, scouts returned with news, enemy patrols nearby, shifting winds, narrow passes. Each time, Saladin listened with unwavering focus, then gave simple instructions. His calmness spread like a protective shield over the men. It made them believe that no matter how dark the night became, they were following someone who could see where others were blind. The deeper they rode into the wilderness, the louder the silence grew. The only sound was the thunder of horses, thousands moving as one, creating a pulse that shook the sleeping earth. Soldiers who had doubted their strength earlier now felt adrenaline rising in their veins. This was not an army fleeing defeat. This was an army gathering momentum, gathering fire. As they crossed the barren plains, the moon slipped behind clouds, plunging everything into near total darkness. A whisper of fear crept through some ranks, fear of the unknown, fear of losing direction, fear of what waited beyond the horizon. But then they looked forward toward Saladin's silhouette. His presence alone cut through the fear like a blade through fog. When the terrain grew rough, some horses stumbled, but not a single complaint rose from the soldiers. Their leader's determination fueled their endurance. They could feel his belief, his vision, his will pressing forward through the darkness. It made the impossible feel within reach. At one point, the sound of hooves seemed to merge with the land itself, like the army had become a living storm. The crusaders, sleeping miles away, would later swear they felt the earth shudder that night, though they did not know why. They did not know that thousands of warriors were riding toward destiny with a resolve that could not be measured by numbers alone. Finally, as the horizon began to pale with the first breath of dawn, Saladin slowed his horse. The entire army halted behind him, breathing heavily, exhausted yet ignited. The sky shifted from black to gray, revealing the outlines of distant hills that marked the next stage of their campaign. And for the first time in hours, the soldiers saw their leader's face. He looked tired but unbreakably determined. His eyes carried the fire of a man who knew that victory required sacrifice, patience, and courage that surpassed fear. The silent march had not weakened them, it had transformed them. And as the sun rose, turning the land gold, every soldier knew one truth with chilling certainty. If this was how Saladin moved in the night, then what he would do in the daylight would shake the world. Night settled heavily over the city, a darkness filled not with peace but with fear. Rumors had spread like wildfire throughout the day, whispers that the Crusaders were preparing a sudden attack, that spies had been seen near the gates, that something terrible was approaching. Mothers clutched their children, shopkeepers closed their doors early, and old men sat outside their homes with worried eyes watching the empty streets. The city wasn't sleeping, it was holding its breath. Inside the fortress, commanders argued in hushed tones, their nerves frayed. Some insisted the rumors were exaggerated, while others believed danger was already at the doorstep. Panic spread faster than truth. People imagined armies hiding in the shadows, swords drawn, ready to strike. Even the most seasoned guards avoided looking into the darkness for too long, afraid they might actually see what they feared. But then, when uncertainty felt like a storm about to break, a single figure stepped out into the night. Saladin walked alone down the silent paths, no torches, no guards, no grand escort. His steps were slow and steady, echoing lightly through the sleeping streets. For a moment the city seemed confused. Why was their leader outside now, when danger was rumored to be closest? At first only a few people noticed him. A woman peeking from behind her door gasped softly, realizing who he was. A shopkeeper lit a small lamp to look again, stunned that the one man who should have been safest inside the fortress was calmly walking among the frightened citizens. Slowly, one by one, people stepped out, drawn by the quiet confidence he carried. He greeted them with a calm nod, speaking to some with gentle words, asking others if their families were safe. There was no fear in his voice, no urgency in his steps. He walked as if the night belonged to him, as if no enemy could dare disturb a city under his watch. And in that calmness, hearts began to steady. The fear that had clung to the air like a shadow began to loosen. Children hiding behind their mothers peeked out, whispering his name as if it were a prayer. To them, Saladin wasn't just a leader, he was hope shaped into a man. When they saw him unafraid, their fear dissolved like mist under sunlight. The mothers who had trembled earlier now felt strength replacing their dread. A simple glimpse of him felt like protection. Guards on the walls watched him move through the streets and felt a sense of shame for their earlier panic. If their commander had enough serenity to walk alone at such a time, then they had no excuse to tremble. His presence was a reminder that true leadership meant sharing the burden of fear, not hiding from it. As he passed by the market, a group of elderly men approached him hesitantly. One of them asked whether the rumors were true. Saladin smiled softly, a smile that carried more reassurance than 100 orders. "Fear gives strength to falsehood," he said quietly, "but trust gives strength to us." Those words spread throughout the night like a blessing, calming every ear that heard them. By the time he reached the mosque courtyard, a small crowd had gathered behind him, not out of fear, but out of comfort. They followed not because he commanded them, but because his calmness drew them like a flame in darkness. The city that had trembled just hours before now began to breathe normally, its heartbeat returning to life. And when Saladin finally turned back toward the fortress, the people watched him leave with tears in their eyes, grateful, humbled, and suddenly brave. They realized that their city had not been protected by walls or soldiers alone. It had been protected by the courage of a leader who walked into their fear and replaced it with faith. There were moments when the world around him seemed to drown in cruelty. War had a way of twisting men, of turning desperation into harshness and fear into violence. Saladin saw all of it: the broken prisoners, the wounded civilians, the anger boiling inside soldiers who had lost brothers and friends. It would have been easy, so easy, to let emotions take control, but he refused. His heart had lines it would not cross, boundaries set by faith and principle that nothing could shake. One afternoon, after a fierce skirmish, several commanders brought captured enemies before him. Their faces were cold, expecting a harsh sentence. One commander even whispered that these captives had shown no mercy, that they deserved none in return. For a moment, the soldiers believed their leader would finally bend, finally answer cruelty with cruelty. But Saladin's eyes held something different, not softness, but unwavering justice. He walked slowly toward the captives, his steps heavy with responsibility. The air around him felt tight, as if the land itself waited for his decision. The prisoners trembled, expecting the worst. Yet Saladin asked questions with calm precision. Were they armed? Did they resist surrender? Were they involved in harming civilians? His judgment was based on truth, not vengeance. The soldiers watching him felt a strange mix of awe and discomfort. They saw how carefully he weighed each life, each action, refusing to be ruled by anger. When one commander insisted that harsh punishment would send a message of strength, Saladin turned to him with a gaze that froze him in place. "If we become what we fight," he said quietly, "then we deserve to lose." The words struck deeper than any sword could. That sentence silenced every man present. It reminded them that victory built on injustice was not victory at all. It was corruption. Rumors of Saladin's strict moral code spread through both friend and enemy ranks. Some admired him, while others feared him more than ever. Because a leader who refused to fall into cruelty was unpredictable, he could not be manipulated by rage. He could not be baited into dishonor. He made decisions from a place of clarity, where justice stood above emotions. There were days when his soldiers begged for permission to retaliate. They had witnessed brutality firsthand, and their hearts burned for payback. But Saladin would stand before them, calm and unyielding. He reminded them that justice was their armor, not hatred. His words often frustrated them until they realized how his principles shaped their strength, giving them a dignity that the enemy could never steal. Even the prisoners sensed something different in him. Those who expected torment found fairness instead. Those who expected humiliation found respect. His treatment did not come from weakness. It came from the certainty that cruelty only breeds more darkness. And a leader guided by light, even in war, forces his enemies to confront their own shadows. Commanders who once doubted him began to change over time. They found themselves lowering their voices, taming their anger, thinking more carefully before acting. His presence alone corrected their tempers. It was as if his discipline extended like a quiet force, reshaping the behavior of everyone around him. They began to understand he wasn't just leading an army, he was shaping a character in every soldier. When word of his conduct reached distant lands, enemies hesitated. They realized they were facing someone who fought not with rage, but with purpose. Someone who did not crumble under cruelty, who absorbed it, purified it, and answered with justice. That frightened them more than any violence could. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the camp was still, soldiers often whispered among themselves about the strength he carried. They knew that the enemy's swords could not break him, and betrayal could not bend him, because the code he lived by, unyielding, pure, and fearless, made his will unbreakable. The morning began with a cold silence that seeped into every corner of the camp. The sky was still dark, but the faintest trace of light stretched across the horizon like a thin blade cutting through the night. Soldiers moved sluggishly, their faces worn and tired, as if the weight of endless battles had carved itself into their bones. It felt like another day of uncertainty, another day of holding on. Hope was fragile, almost invisible. Then, as the first breath of dawn touched the land, something shifted. Saladin stepped out of his tent, and for the first time in what felt like ages, he carried his banner in his own hand. The banner, once dimmed by dust and exhaustion, seemed to glow in the early light. Soldiers who had been half asleep straightened instantly. There was something powerful, almost otherworldly, in the image of their leader holding the symbol of their cause. His footsteps were slow but full of purpose. Every movement felt deliberate, as if he were reminding his army and himself, that the story was far from over. The cold breeze tugged at the edges of the banner, and with every ripple, the soldiers remembered who they were. Not defeated warriors, not broken survivors, they were men who still had breath, strength, and a leader whose will refused to collapse. One young soldier wiped his eyes, thinking the sight must be a dream. But when he looked again, Saladin's figure remained steady, framed by the rising light. The soldier felt something inside him stretch awake, something he had thought died on old battlefields. It was courage, quiet, steady courage. As Saladin walked through the ranks, the army began to stir. Men who moments ago had doubted their future now found themselves standing straighter. Their eyes followed the banner as if it were a beacon piercing through their internal darkness. Each step he took seemed to pull them out of despair and into a powerful, silent resolve. When he reached the center of the camp, he planted the banner firmly into the ground. The soft thud echoed louder than a war drum. Soldiers froze, watching as the fabric fluttered in the rising sun. That single act, simple, wordless, sent a shiver through every heart. It was not a declaration of victory. It was a declaration that fear had no place among them anymore. Some soldiers felt tears burning in their eyes, though they didn't know why. It wasn't sadness. It was the overwhelming realization that their leader had not given up, that he was still standing, still fighting, still believing. And if he stood firm, how could they allow themselves to fall apart? The dawn grew brighter, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. The light fell on their armor, their faces, their weapons, turning the whole camp into a living portrait of resilience. For the first time in many weeks, the soldiers felt warmth not just from the sun, but from deep inside their chests. Fear, which had wrapped around them like chains, began to loosen. Saladin finally looked at his army, his tired, wounded, faithful army, and the determination in his eyes spoke louder than any speech. He didn't need to shout commands, he didn't need to promise victory. His presence was enough. The army felt it, an unspoken message that today was the turning point. Today, fear would die and resolve would rise. And when the sun finally broke fully over the horizon, flooding the land with brilliant light, a strange silence fell over the camp. But this time, it wasn't the silence of dread. It was the silence of unity, of strength, of an entire army breathing as one. In that silence, every man understood the truth without words. They were ready again. Their leader had reignited the fire in their hearts, and dawn itself had bowed before their renewed courage. He stood alone in the silent night, staring at the flickering lamps across the distant Crusader encampments. To anyone watching, he looked calm, but inside him burned a storm that refused to rest. Saladin knew that every step he took, every decision he made, carried the weight of an entire Ummah. Failure was not an option, and the memory of Hattin's shadow haunted him like a whisper in the dark. But instead of breaking him, it carved him into something unshakable. He remembered the eyes of the captives from previous battles, some cold with defiance, others trembling with fear. Yet Saladin carried no hatred for them. His heart was molded by justice, not cruelty. Still, he knew the enemy would show no mercy if they ever got the upper hand again. The thought tightened something inside his chest, not out of fear for himself, but fear for the innocent lives counting on him to stand firm against the storm. Every night he walked through his camp to read the emotions of his soldiers. Some were exhausted, some wounded, some silently praying. The crackling fires cast trembling shadows, and the men looked up to him as if seeing a symbol of hope. And Saladin felt each pair of eyes settle on him like a responsibility carved into stone. He had to rise above his own limits. He had to become the shield they needed. He paused near a group of young soldiers, boys with swords too heavy for their hands, courage too large for their age. They tried to smile when they saw him, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They were thinking about dawn, about swords clashing, about death lurking beyond the horizon. Saladin placed a reassuring hand on one soldier's shoulder, and in that moment the boy's trembling stopped. It was small, but it strengthened him too. Returning to his tent, he unfurled the maps again and again, tracing routes by lantern light until his fingers went numb. Every pathway seemed surrounded by danger, every choice carried risk, but Saladin had learned long ago that fear loses its power when faced head-on. The more the enemy tried to create terror, the stronger his resolve grew. He was prepared to make decisions that would test the limits of his courage. The night deepened, and the wind whispered through the canvas of his tent. Saladin closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. He wasn't merely fighting an army, he was fighting the consequences of centuries of conflict, mistrust, and bloodshed. But somewhere deep within, he felt a strange calm rise, as if a voice reminded him that justice never walks alone. As he stepped outside again, the sky above him shimmered with stars. He gazed upward, seeking strength beyond the world's chaos. The vastness made his battles feel both small and monumental at the same time. He drew a slow breath. Tomorrow's clash would not just shape territories, it would shape hearts, futures, and the legacy of generations. He felt the gravity of that truth settle into him like cold steel. He moved toward the edge of the camp, where the dark fields stretched endlessly ahead. The silence felt alive, almost watching him. Saladin understood the enemy was also preparing, sharpening their weapons, planning their next move. But he carried something they didn't, an unbreakable will shaped not by rage, but by purpose. The darkness did not frighten him. It only reminded him how brightly conviction can burn. As he stood at the boundary of the camp, a sudden memory flashed faces of people he had protected, villages he had rebuilt, prayers whispered behind him after victories. These memories were not burdens, they were armor. With each life he had safeguarded, he had grown stronger. With each injustice he had corrected, he felt a deeper drive to keep moving forward. This was more than a war. It was a responsibility wrapped in faith. When he finally turned back toward the sleeping camp, he walked with the steady steps of a man who had already fought half the battle within himself. The fear, the shadows, the uncertainty, none of them could conquer a heart that refused to bow. Saladin knew tomorrow might bring chaos, but tonight he had something even greater, clarity. And in that clarity, he found the courage to rise again. The final march began under a sky heavy with silence. Saladin rode at the front, each hoof beat echoing like a heartbeat against the earth. His men followed, their breaths visible in the early morning chill. The air felt thick with something unspoken, an invisible tension that wrapped itself around every soldier. Saladin could sense it too, but his expression remained firm. He had learned to bury his fears deep enough that even the night couldn't find them. As they moved forward, the wind seemed to whisper fragments of the past, echoes of battles won and lost. Every victory had come with a price, every loss had carved lessons into his soul. But today felt different. It felt as if fate itself had stepped onto the battlefield. Saladin's fingers tightened around the reins, not in fear, but in focus. He was stepping into a moment that would decide far more than land or power. The distant horizon began to glow faintly, revealing the landscape ahead. The enemy was out there, hidden in the grains of sand, waiting like a predator in the shadows. Saladin's gaze sharpened. He wasn't intimidated. He was calculating, observing the subtle shifts in wind and terrain. He knew that battles were not won by strength alone. They were decided in the mind long before swords ever clashed. He dismounted to walk among his soldiers. Their faces were marked with determination, yet behind their eyes lingered the quiet fear of what sunrise might bring. Saladin felt their unspoken questions, their silent doubts. He didn't need to deliver a speech. His presence alone whispered reassurance. A single glance from him carried emotions words could never express, and in that moment hearts steadied. A young soldier approached hesitantly, his voice trembling as he asked if they would prevail. Saladin placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the weight of youth and inexperience beneath his palm. His answer was simple: victory belongs to those who stand with truth and courage. The boy's fear melted, replaced by fire. It was moments like these that reminded Saladin why he fought, not for glory, but to ignite courage where fear tried to take root. The camp fell silent again as he returned to the front. The faint sounds of preparation faded behind him. He could feel an invisible line stretching through the land, separating what was and what would soon be. That thin line was where destiny lived, and he was ready to cross it. The closer he drew to the battlefield, the heavier the world felt, as if time itself was holding its breath. He paused atop a small rise, surveying the land with eyes sharpened by years of experience. Every dip, every ridge, every shadow was a clue. He imagined the enemy's movements, their strategies, their vulnerabilities. The battlefield was a puzzle only the patient could solve, and Saladin had mastered the art of reading the silent language of war. His heartbeat slowed as clarity settled into him like a cold wave. A sudden gust of wind brushed past, carrying the faint scent of dust and steel. It sent chills through the ranks, but Saladin stood unmoved. To him, it wasn't a warning. It was a reminder. A reminder that storms come and go, but resolve remains. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, gathering every ounce of strength, every memory of sacrifice, every whisper of faith that had kept him standing through the darkest hours. He lifted his gaze, and in that single motion everything changed. The soldiers straightened, the atmosphere hardened, and the fear that once crept through the air seemed to evaporate. It was as if his determination spread through the ranks like a silent command. No words were spoken, yet every man felt the shift, an awakening of purpose, a sharpening of spirit. As the final moment approached, Saladin stepped forward, not as a warrior hungry for battle, but as a guardian carrying the weight of countless prayers. The ground beneath him trembled faintly, as if acknowledging the gravity of what was about to unfold. He breathed deeply, steady and unbroken. No matter how dark the day ahead might become, he would face it with a heart that refused to bow. In that stillness before the storm, he became the embodiment of resolve itself. And so, from the ashes of fear and the weight of impossible odds, Saladin rose not just as a commander, but as a symbol of what an unbreakable will can create. His courage echoed beyond the battlefield, and still whispers to those who dare to rise after falling.